Star Wars Andor has continued doing what it does best, showing us the day-to-day struggles of the people of the Star Wars universe, which is why we consider it the best live-action Star Wars show to date. In a recent episode, it showed us a side of the Empire that expanded universe material has often mentioned but rarely explored: the brutal Imperial prison system. The past few episodes have shown us the grueling slave factories of Narkina 5, an Imperial penal colony where prisoners from all over the galaxy are sent to be worked to death. But though Narkina 5 looks like absolute hell, it's actually a far cry from some of the worst Imperial prisons. In this video, we'll be taking a look at some Legends material to show you the 5 worst Imperial prisons.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
As seen in Andor, in both canon and Legends, the Empire maintained what's called a prison industrial complex. In a nutshell, this meant that the Empire generally put prisoners to work in labor camps, where prisoners effectively became slaves doing grueling work for no pay. This led to prison labor being a crucial component of the Empire's industrial sector, which in turn created incentives for the Empire to toss as many people in prison as they could get away with. This vile system encouraged the Empire to be tyrannical in other ways as well, since it meant arresting political opponents of the Empire not only crippled opposition movements, but also made Imperial industry stronger. In some cases, entire species that had hosted rebel movements were declared guilty of treason en masse, stripped of their rights, and then rounded up and enslaved as part of this program, as we'll be discussing later. In Legends especially, however, not all Imperial prisons were meant to serve as a source of free labor. Some were geared toward outright torture, or had other cruel and inhumane uses for inmates. In any case, many of the worst Imperial prisons were so notorious that their names were known all over the galaxy, such as Star's End or the spice mines of Kessel. These made Narkina 5 look like a pleasant holiday destination. The most notorious Imperial prison was Kessel, which in Legends was a desolate, misshapen planet in the distant Outer Rim. For centuries, Kessel had been used as a prison by the Republic, but the Empire made the spice mining operation there far worse, imposing stricter quotas and regularly working inmate miners to death. Kessel was a pretty awful world on its own, as it had a thin atmosphere that kept the planet extremely cold. Miners there had to wear environment suits just to survive, else they were guaranteed a painful death. But what made the spice mines of Kessel especially horrifying was what the inmates there were mining. Many kinds of spice were found on Kessel, but the most potent and most valuable was glitterstim, which could be found nowhere else. Glitterstim's unique properties put it in high demand among medical researchers and wealthy addicts alike, which was why the Republic and Empire bothered with it instead of leaving it to the galaxy's drug lords. But mining glitterstim was incredibly hazardous for 2 reasons. First, because it was photoactive, meaning that it had to be mined in total darkness, and secondly, because glitterstim spice was derived from the preserved webs of energy spiders that lived in Kessel's depths. These spiders fed on the life forces of other living beings, and spice miners had to be careful to avoid them, lest their brains end up as part of the product. Avoiding the energy spiders was easier said than done, since the spiders actively preyed on the miners and were impervious to blaster bolts. This was worsened by the fact that the miners had to work in total darkness, meaning that they often didn't see the spiders coming until their blade-like legs were slicing through their limbs. The darkness of Kessel's mines was also a danger in itself, since it made accidents incredibly common, and such accidents frequently ended up puncturing environment suits. All these factors made labor in the mines of Kessel incredibly deadly, not to mention terrifying. Kessel wasn't the only Imperial prison known for its cruel and unusual conditions. Around the time of the Battle of Yavin, the Empire also established a prison on Dathomir, where they stored political prisoners that were considered too valuable to execute, but too influential to incarcerate in a public facility. The Dathomir Imperial prison was the hole into which the Empire tossed prisoners it wanted forgotten, and that meant that the prison staff had little to no oversight, ensuring terrible conditions for Dathomir's inmates. But as you might have already guessed, from this prison's location, the cruelty of the prison authorities wasn't the only factor that made this facility so horrific. Dathomir was a world steeped in the Force, and across different parts of the planet, both the light side and the dark side were incredibly strong in legends. The Force on Dathomir was wild and untamed, and it warped the minds of the Empire's inmates. This effect worsened once the Night Sisters got involved. Shortly after the prison's construction, a clan of Night Sisters, not Mother Talzin's to be clear, approached the prison's warden and offered their help in keeping the inmates under control. The foolish Imperials accepted, and the Night Sisters set about breaking the minds of the inmates, then eventually those of the guards as well. When news of these developments reached the Emperor, he ordered the prison's landing strips and all ships docked on Dathomir to be destroyed, but he abandoned the Imperial personnel and prisoners alike to their fate, allowing the Night Sisters to enslave them all. Another of the more infamous Imperial prisons was known as Star's End. Technically, Star's End was owned and operated exclusively by the corporate sector authority, but since the corporate sector was an Imperial client state and the CSA was basically the second voice of the Empire, we feel justified in including it here. Located on the edge of the galaxy on the asteroid Midas 7, Star's End was an incredibly advanced prison that was said to be completely impregnable and escape-proof. The prison's main tower featured incredibly durable armor, anti-concussion fields to make the structure even more durable, state-of-the-art communication systems, 2 layers of deflector shields, 6 turbo laser turrets, and an ion cannon. Star's End could more than defend itself, and its armor could shrug off fire even from Star Destroyer grade turbo lasers. But what made Star's End truly nightmarish is how it dealt with its prisoners. Inmates at Star's End were stored in stasis booths, which kept prisoners in a state of stasis indefinitely. Star's End was essentially cold storage for living beings, and those who were sent there were trapped in a state between life and death. Of course, not all of the Empire's cruelest prisons relied on man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. Consider, for instance, the Tracy Proving Grounds, an Imperial prison facility that also served as a manufacturing complex for Imperial military hardware. Some of the prisoners there were part of the manufacturing process, but most inmates were sent to Tracy to help with another part of the manufacturing process, testing. At the Tracy Proving Grounds, completed products were tested on the inmates who were lined up to be gunned down by new models of blaster or subjected to anti-armor rounds from Imperial walkers. Our last example of one of the Empire's most terrible prisons was a joint venture between the Empire and Black Scale Clan, a clan of Trandoshan slavers. This facility was Avatar Orbital Platform, a space station built into a small asteroid that acted as the primary slave processing hub for Kashyyyk. During the reign of the Empire, Kashyyyk was subjected to Imperial martial law, and the entire Wookiee species was branded as enemies of the Empire for their government's role in helping several Jedi escape the Great Purge. The whole species was tossed into the Imperial prison industrial complex, with Trandoshan slavers given free license by the Empire to kidnap entire Wookiee families to be processed. Almost all Wookiee slaves were processed by Black Scale Clan members aboard Avatar. Though the facility was built to act as a prison, few of its inmates stayed for long, as the Wookiees brought to Avatar were typically shipped off to Imperial black sites to serve as manual laborers. However, since Avatar's day-to-day operations were run by the Black Scale Trandoshans, whose hatred for the Wookiees knew no bounds, Wookiee slaves still suffered terribly during their brief stays on the station. The Trandoshans gleefully tormented their captives, often making a point of splitting up families during processing, making the Avatar Orbital Platform one of the cruelest Imperial prisons in the galaxy. Well, that was a bit of a sobering one. Remember folks, the Empire was evil, and anyone who says otherwise is cringe. But what do you think? Are there other terrible Imperial prisons that you think we should have mentioned in this list? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.